I'll never forget the C I got on my first English paper in college. I was walking across the quad in the warm, eucalyptus-scented California air when I confidently pulled my paper from my bag to look at the comments. I was sure they'd be lovely. The day suddenly slid into grayscale as I saw my grade. After lifetime of A and great job written at the bottom of every paper, fresh from winning the English award at my high school awards night, I was totally unprepared for the many scrawled notes about the problems in my paper. I walked into class the next day in a daze and listened to my professor as he went into a terrifying but effective rant. Apparently, I wasn't the only freshman to confidently turn in a paper that wasn't nearly complex enough. His speech has stuck with me. "Your rough draft," he said at one point, "is a chair." He scrawled an incredibly messy chair on the whiteboard in front of us for emphasis. "And you have to take that chair," he sputtered, "and build a boat." We students glanced at each other, a little overwhelmed. A boat? We have to build a boat? Today, I want to talk about the chair and the boat and some of the process that happens in between. Because let's face it, most kids, high school me included, really struggle to understand the work that happens between rough drafts and final drafts. And it's perhaps the most crucial part of the writing process. We know this. So the strategy we're going to dive into now, self-editing stations, can really help scaffold editing for your students, saving them from falling into the usual traps, allowing you to intervene on behalf of key writing improvements you're trying to help them make before they turn in their work, and ultimately saving your commenting time for only the most important personalized suggestions, which is something we're making kind of a theme right now here at the Spark Creativity Teacher podcast. So are you ready? Let's dive in. Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher podcast, a podcast for English teachers looking for more. More creativity, more engagement, more joy, and no more scripted curriculum, lesson planning ruts, or boring book lists. I'm Betsy Potash, and I'm honored you're trusting me to help. You're not alone on this creative journey anymore. The great thing about self-editing stations is that they are infinitely adaptable. Maybe our students are struggling the most right now with explaining their quotations. They introduce them pretty well, then they quote the text, and then nothing. You can make a station for that. Maybe their biggest problem is with the thesis. Their theses are not complex enough, they can't be argued, they're really just statements. No problem, that's perfect for a station. Maybe you feel like every paper you read is starting with a somewhat lame but well-intentioned rhetorical question. Okay, time for a station on hooks. All of these things make great stations. You can have a station about something small, or you can have a station about something big, something really that's influencing every paper in a major way. But let's rewind for a second and talk about how to set up these stations. At each station around your room, you're going to want to provide, for starters, just a clear label for the station. Station 1, thesis statements. Station 2, misplaced modifiers, whatever it is. So kids know what they're going to be addressing at that station. Then you want to have a really clear task so they know what they're going to be doing at that station. The label is not enough. Misplaced modifiers, that's not enough to get students to go through their papers and find their misplaced modifiers and fix them. You've got your label, but then you also have a really specific task that walks them through how they're going to use the station, what they're going to do with their paper, what the end goal is. And then once you have your task and you have your label, the really key thing is to have any and every resource you can think of to help students do the task. So, for example, let's talk about a thesis station, which we just mentioned. You want your students to spend time making sure their thesis is arguable. It's something they tend to look at just in 5 seconds and be like, oh yeah, it seems arguable, moving on. They're really struggling to understand what you mean by arguable. They're struggling to make the fix. So some resources you might want to provide them would be a list of common mistakes you're seeing with the thesis and fixes for those mistakes. So maybe in the last round of papers, you saw 50 different theses, that weren't really arguable. You can create a list of common mistakes, like, look at this one, guys, and then an explanation, here's why it's not arguable, and then a fix, here's how you could fix one like this. Maybe you do that for like 10 different models, and you have that as a resource at the table. You don't put anyone's name on them. You don't hurt anyone's feelings. They don't even have to be directly from student papers. It can just be similar to what you've seen. Some examples, some models of how to fix them that students can just look at really directly. Another thing you could put out at this station would be some papers from the past that were really stellar, that had arguable theses that knocked your socks off. They can be from that year. They can be from your own writing in college. They can be from the year before. You put those papers down, you highlight the section that you'd like students to see, and you add a Post-it, or you write in the margins like, wow, check out this amazing arguable thesis. Just imagine sitting down with this person over dinner and arguing about this. Like, wouldn't there be so much to say? Show them why it's so good and really explain it to them. Another thing you could have at this station would be some multimedia that would help students understand what you want them to do. So maybe that's a tutorial video that you've created where you actually walk through the process of fixing an introduction. Or maybe it's something amazing that you found on YouTube from a writing site that just shows exactly what you think would be wonderful for students to do. And they can play the video and they can watch. You can have a whole bunch of different types of resources, different platforms, different depth levels, right? Because kids are going to come to this station with a variety of knowledge and skill, and you are trying to give them anything that might help. By the way, once you set up all these resources for this station, keep yourself organized with these wonderful resources, and you can use them time after time when you're approaching a similar problem with a different set of students. Okay, so you have all these resources, you have your task, you have your label, and students can just come over to the station, see exactly what they need to do, look through all the resources, and then do it. And then they're going to move on to another station. Now, before they move on, though, you may want to have a few additional steps besides the self-editing. So the goal today is self-editing, and that's fantastic. You can have students look through and edit their own work. But if you want to take it a step further, there's no reason you can't integrate a little bit of peer work at the same time. So for example, after students look through all the resources, make their own fixes, they might turn to a partner and explain kind of how they had their thesis before, what they learned from looking at the resources, and how they've adjusted to make sure that their thesis is arguable after looking at all those models. Now, they're processing everything that they've learned and learning it on a deeper level by teaching it to someone else. They're also having a chance to get feedback on their process if maybe they've misunderstood something, or they feel they've fixed their thesis but they haven't quite finished it off, right? Then their partner has a chance to help them take it even a step further, even get a little bit better before they leave that station. Okay, so you're going to set these up around your room, and just keep in mind your stations can be for big elements like the thesis or the conclusion, but they can also be for small things. Maybe your students are really struggling with the transitions between paragraphs. Maybe they're really struggling with a basic grammar concept like comma splice. Whatever it is, you're allowed to build a station around it. They don't have to match in their level of sort of big pictureness and drilling down. So you can just take your students right where they are and help them with the things they need. I want to say that when it comes to the small grammar things, sometimes it helps to have one station that's just kind of about grammar, and mechanics, where you give them maybe 5 or 6 things that you're seeing that are really common issues, and you have them look for those things in their paper, and then maybe also look for those things in a partner's paper. Or you can go full bore and divide those things into their own individual stations, where you have, one station for pronoun antecedent agreement, if it's that big of a deal, if everyone is struggling that much with it. Okay, so self-editing stations don't have to be limited to analytical writing either. I think all the examples I've given so far have related more to like argument writing, but they're also a great way to approach narrative and other forms of creative writing. Maybe you've been working on things like sensory description, characterization, pacing, or dialogue. You can also turn these elements into really interesting station themes for students to work through during their editing process. And you can invite kids to reflect on how they're weaving these elements you've been working on into their writing. So maybe you've had all these mini lessons on using more sensory detail, and you've been practicing it, and now they've integrated it into a story. One of your stations can be about description and sensory detail, where they go back through, they look for what they're doing in terms of sensory detail in their paper. They read, they check, do they have sight? Do they have smell? Do they have sound, touch, taste? Do they feel like it's really bringing the description to life? Is there a sense they haven't hit on that they want to add? Have they overdone it? You can ask these kinds of questions in your editing station task, and then you can have them switch with a partner and kind of go through. Similarly, are there places where the sensory description is feeling amazing? Are there places where you feel like it's just sort of tacked on and it doesn't make sense? When they leave that station, it will be part of their process of integrating all that you've worked on into their final draft. And you're scaffolding this process of editing that students tend to find tricky. So one final thing, this scaffolding process, I want to mention that it doesn't have to wait until the transition from the almost final draft to the final draft. You could easily have these self-editing stations earlier in the process. Maybe you're just really drilling down on writing the introduction of a paper or the opening of a narrative, and you'd like to take 20 minutes to have students do some self-editing on just that one small step before they go beyond it into the whole paper, or their whole narrative. Because if they can really crush the beginning, they're going to feel more ready to go to the second paragraph. And in fact, the second paragraph is going to flow better if they already feel really good about their beginning. That is an option. Okay, you can wait. You can do the self-editing stations really close to the end of your process, but you can also do it with any section of the writing, any smaller section along the way. The process is the same. You give them a task, you give them good models, and then you help them to improve along the way. So I think self-editing stations can be a really valuable resource for scaffolding this process of editing that students just tend to struggle with. I have been there. You have probably been there. When we first become writers who care, the editing process feels like it's just going to be kind of correcting typos, maybe following through on like one comment from a peer editor or a teacher, and then you're done. And this process helps kids not only to improve their writing, but to understand what the process of editing can be like. And the icing on the cake really is that instead of writing comments about these things that you're having your self-editing stations for 90 times in the comments of, in the margins of your students' work, you're going to be able to provide more tailored feedback because you're already going to have helped them so much with these things in advance. And hopefully that's going to save you a lot of time when it comes to commenting. It's also going to allow students to understand your reference right away. If you say this thesis still isn't feeling arguable, they know what you're talking about, right? If you've done a station on it, they know very clearly that that was something that you guys were working on. They have a sense for what's behind that quick comment. Thanks so much for joining me today to talk about self-editing stations and how they can be a really valuable tool in your students' writing process and help you to provide more tailored, specific feedback in less time. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay creative.